with the Marine.
With the Marine.
All right.
Yeah.
We are up and running. Anything you say now will be recorded for the internet, including your phone rings. So it's good to see everybody, and it is especially good to come back together for this study session as we are still recovering from the tragedies of the weekend in Pittsburgh. And it's important to continue to be together and to continue to study. If you check online, if you weren't here on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, I talked about how after 9/11, that was also the Jewish response. And I think that the YouTube videos have been loaded to the TI website if you weren't able to be here in person for that. And also a reminder that this coming Shabbat is a solidarity Shabbat, that people are being encouraged to go to synagogue all over the world. So please find a synagogue to go to. Doesn't even matter if you're Jewish. Doesn't matter if your friends are Jewish. Bring them, show up, and show that we will not be intimidated and we will not be kept from our places of worship. With that in mind, we are going to be dealing with a different passing. In this particular week's parasha of Chayei Sarah, we'll be talking about the passing and specifically the burial of Sarah and specifically the location of the burial place of Sarah. Not the actual burial place, but where the burial place is located. You'll see. You'll see. Yeah. Page 127. We're actually starting at the beginning this week. So that should make it easy to find. We're in chapter 23, verse 1. For those of you who have been keeping up with the stories so far, what happened right before this parasha? What happened at the end of last week's Torah portion? The Akedah happened right through the middle, which was the near sacrifice of Isaac. And then it finished off, of course, with the part that everybody skips because it's genealogy.
Ishmael.
No, that happened earlier. That was earlier in the week, or earlier in the parasha. The last thing that was happening.
He went to get a wife.
No, that's going to happen in this week's parasha.
Abraham is told about his relatives, Nahor.
Facebook gives him a post.
Bethuel had Rivka.
Exactly.
We get told her.
Yeah, we get the Facebook post of Abraham's extended family continuing to grow. So he gets updated that there are more relatives out there, and this, of course, is going to be a signal that it's time for Isaac to go marry one of them, namely Rivka. But we're going to be focused, as I said, on the beginning of our Torah portion, which is the passing of Sarah, although some do link her passing to the arrival of Rivka, that she could not pass until a worthy successor was available. So let's go ahead and start reading. I need a volunteer, as always.
Sarah's lifetime, the span of Sarah's life came to 127 years. Sarah died in Kiryat Arba, now Hebron, in the land of Canaan, and Abraham proceeded to mourn for Sarah and to bewail her. Then Abraham rose from beside his dead and spoke to the Hittites, saying, I am a resident alien among you. Sell me a burial site among you, that I may remove my dead for burial.
Pause there. Okay. So what just happened? Sarah died, right? And where did she die?
In Hebron.
Wait, where?
Hebron.
In Canaan.
We're going to go back and forth with different spellings of Hebron, but just bear with me. Oh, that's an N. And then all of this seems to be in the land of Canaan. Okay. Kiryat Arba is being equated to Hebron. Where's that? And don't say Canaan, that's a cheat. Where in Canaan is Kiryat Arba or Hebron?
It's below Jerusalem.
The map's in with the kids now.
Right.
There's a map in the back of the book if you're interested.
Yeah, it's below, it's south of Jerusalem.
Everything's below Jerusalem.
Yeah, like about 20 miles or something.
Something like that. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
It's southern.
It's southern,
It's
in
now
the-
currently in
in
what's
the
called
West
the
Bank.
West Bank.
Right.
And Chevron it appears to have been the later name, and the original name or the earliest name seems to have been Kiryat Arba. And we get that from the Hebrew text itself, which is Kiryat Arba, which is known as Chevron, which is always a little bit of a question of, well, wait, when was the then and when is the now of the author? You understand the question there?
Yeah.
Right? If it says that it was called Kiryat Arba and it is also called Hebron, was that a simultaneous name? Was that a name change? If it was a name change, did the name change happen recently in the distant past? It's a little ambiguous from the text, but we are going to circle back around to the city in just a bit. But I want to deal with something else in the quote that we just did, which is the order of Abraham's responses. Right. So draw a timeline for me, if you will. Right. Sarah dies.
Abraham mourns and cries. He
Abraham-
first mourns.
Well, here's where English isn't always your friend. And where if you were reading some of the commentaries, you would be like totally going, huh? Why are they talking about this? The Hebrew does not say, excuse me, Abraham proceeded to mourn. It says, in fact, literally, and Abraham came to give a eulogy, to eulogize for Sarah.
Right.
Well,
That's not-
where did he come from? Right?
He was down in tent number
She
2.
dies. It appears to be that Abraham arrives, which would imply that he wasn't there when she died,
Right. That's the
that Abraham wasn't at her bedside,
He was at that case.
Akedah.
which leads to many interpretations that Abraham was at the Akedah, at the near sacrifice of Isaac, and that during that moment when Isaac was almost killed, Sarah actually did die. And as he returns, he then has to go and find out that while in his absence, Sarah passed away, which makes the Akedah even more poignant and sad as an event.
I remember reading a midrash or something somewhere that she died because she heard.
That she was heard the news that he had been killed, that Isaac actually had died, and that killed her. Yes, there are many interpretations that say that this was instigation of her death. Okay, so we got a timeline now, which seems to imply that she dies, Abraham arrives, and then what's he do?
Purchased the cave.
That's later on.
He mourns, he wails, then he rises up from something.
From the presence of
All right, so again, the term mourn is
Is what?
actually eulogizing, right? A hesped,
Okay, so
right? He gives her a eulogy, and then he wails. Nothing to do with the mammals of the ocean, but is sad. And then he gets down to the buying of the cave in order to actually bury. Okay.
but it's kind of interesting, the sentence that says he rose from the side for his dead.
Yes.
So, I mean,
She was laying
was
on
that
the
what
table.
was that like sitting Shiva?
Well, according to Jewish law,
the body.
that wouldn't work because you don't sit Shiva before the person is buried.
But you watch over a body.
But you watch it, yes.
But you also have to bury the body. You can't sit there indefinitely. So the timeline is a little confusing. And the whole act is different than we would do in a modern Jewish funeral, right? In the modern Jewish funeral, the person would die. We would, well, probably already have the plot purchased, but the person dies, we bury them. The person dies, we bury and eulogize, usually at the same moment, the same funeral service. And then we would go for Shiva and 7 days, and then we would rise, if that's what the getting up here is referring to. But it's most likely just a matter of he was consumed by grief, recounting her greatness, and then realized that he needed to bury her, and that he couldn't just sit here being heartbroken. He had a job to attend to, which was to make sure that his wife was properly laid to rest. Okay, with that in mind, we are going to dive in to.
Did he prepare the body himself?
That would have been the normal pattern. Let's see if I can get those over there. At the.
And this is the tomb of the patriarch.
Yes.
This is what's called the Cave of Machpelah, and that is indeed where Abraham will eventually be buried as well, but Sarah is the first one to be buried. And then we get a collection of other people going forward through the family history, to the family tomb. And that is said to be in Kiryat Arba, also known as Chevron. Okay, so let's talk about our memorializing of our dearly departed. So, good Talmudic question of what is the purpose of doing this hesped, of doing this eulogy? If you would read it on the memorial prayer side.
Okay.
The one that begins with is the memorial prayer.
Is the memorial prayer in honor of the living or for the deceased?
Oh.
And what is the difference?
All right, let's make sure we get the question clear, because if you don't know what the question is, you can't understand the answer. Why do we do a eulogy? Is this something just purely to give honor to the person who has died? Or do we give the eulogy because this is important for the living mourners who are left behind? Makes sense? Right? Not important to them like somehow it's like, ooh, look at me, I was married to this dead person. It's in the sense that they need to express something. It's their need that is being met by the giving of a eulogy. Or is the need that's being met the need of the deceased? Understand the question that's being asked?
Yeah.
Okay. Answer.
If one says, I do not wish to be lamented.
Right? That's where it makes a difference. Right? If someone told you, when I die, no eulogies. If it was purely in honor of the deceased, then the deceased would have the right to say, no eulogies, and we would have to honor that. If, on the other hand, it is to also be there for the living, for the mourners, then the deceased doesn't have the right to remove from them the ability to mourn through the giving of a eulogy. Make sense? Okay, onward.
Or, on the other hand, if his heirs do not want to pay the mourner, if it is an honor for the deceased, then only he can give orders. But if it is for the living, then can they only change it?
Then only they, only they can change it. So the opposite side would be if you think the mourners are the only ones who have the rights here, then if it's too expensive to hire someone to do a eulogy, then you don't have to do it, right? Because it's our need. We can decide whether we want to pay for it. But if it's for the dead person's need, then we don't get to rip them off of the eulogy that they need just because we don't want to pay for it. So we see how the different needs lead to who's in control of deciding yes or no. Yes? No. Okay. So let's get some proof text.
Come, listen, Genesis 23. And Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Now, if this were only an honor for the living, should the body of Sarah have been kept till Abraham came for his honor? No, Sarah herself was pleased that Abraham should be honored because of her.
All right, so this leaves us actually unreconciled, which is typical of most Talmudic passages, because the first opinion says, here's some proof. The proof of who the mourning is really for comes because Abraham arrives after she dies. If the mourning was for her, if the eulogy was about her, then we would have just gone ahead and buried her as soon as she died. We wouldn't have waited for him to show up because her needs come before his needs. Make sense? Right? Which, by the way, is the general rule, which is if someone dies and someone else says, oh man, I was just about ready to go on a cruise. Can we postpone the funeral until after I get back? Because, I don't want to lose my deposit, blah, 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 blah. And no, you bury the person now and you cancel your cruise, right? That's how we do things because it is for the honor of the deceased. And that's what the first opinion here is saying, is that if it was for her, then we wouldn't have waited for Abraham. Since we did wait for Abraham, then it must be for him, not for her. At which point they're saying it's okay that we waited for him because he had to be given the chance to do this eulogy or else he would have been deprived of that opportunity. Question?
No,
Okay.
then it says he is honored because right after this,
Right.
in the text, it says you are an elect of God or prince of God.
He gets a different kind of honor in a moment from the residents.
He does this, and then there's an acknowledgement.
Right.
That,
But in the Talmud, there's actually a rebuttal to this line of thinking. Right. This is the Talmud doesn't always tell you who's talking or who's making an objection or a rebuttal, or who's making an answer, and who's making questions. That's part of learning how to study Talmud, is learning what each sentence is trying to do, whether it's an attack, a response, a question. So when we get this nay, it's basically saying your proof that it must be about the mourner because we waited for Abraham rather than doing her burial immediately is invalid, because Sarah wouldn't have felt that her eulogy had been done right if he hadn't been there. Yes, I think that's proper English. If Abraham had missed her funeral, she would not have felt properly honored. Therefore, the delay wasn't about him. The delay was about her, which indeed is also modern halakha, which is to say, if your family is living in Alaska and you pass away, then you wait until the family can get down expeditiously, not taking their own sweet time, but to get down for the funeral, to be able to properly honor them by having the family gather. Indeed, this is why most funerals in the United States are usually delayed by a day or two. We don't bury most people on the same day in this country. In the land of Israel, Yerach, you can confirm this, most funerals are either the same day or the next day.
Same day.
Right. I mean, if they die late at night, we wait till the next day. But it's because in Israel, everybody can drive anywhere. I mean, there's like, well, how far do you have to come? Even if somebody's in Eilat, the funeral's in Eilat and someone lives in Haifa, that's still not that bad. You can easily get there for the funeral once you get the news and you head off. But back in the old days when travel was not quite as quick, and in our modern days in countries like America that are a little larger than Israel, we have to sometimes delay in order that the honor of the deceased can be met by having the right people come to do the eulogy, by having the husband, the children, or others that are essential for being there to show the proper respect to the person who has passed. So in the end, we don't get an answer to our first question, but instead we get two answers that are equally important for understanding our modern world, which is that, yes, we are doing the funeral for those who are the mourners. That's why we need to make sure they have a chance to be there. And we're also only delaying it because we know that the deceased would want those mourners to be present for that funeral. Make sense? Good. Little practical. Onwards, we're going to get back into why she was buried there.
the name of that town is due to it changing ownership 4 times. First, it belonged to the tribe of Judah. Then it became the private property of Calev of that tribe. Subsequently, it became a city of priests, and eventually one of the cities of refuge. This is why only its outskirts were given to Calev, as is apparent from the wording in Joshua 21.
All right, so we're going to begin opening up this question of what do we mean when we say Arba, right? Because it's called Kiryat Arba, right? The city or the town of Arba, which is basically 4. So it's the land of 4, the town of 4, right? Foresville. Why is it called Foresville? And so this from Chizkuni is one explanation. It's Foresville because it's been going to be passed through 4 different hands. Good. Any problems with that explanation? In where we are?
Allotted yet.
Thank you. There's no Judah.
Yeah, but it's like,
Judah hasn't been born yet.
We haven't yet.
wait in the future.
Well, I mean, Judah hasn't been born yet, and the tribe of Judah definitely hasn't been born yet, and the allotment of the land to the tribe of Judah hasn't happened yet. We've got to go through the whole time of slavery and all of the coming out. So to call it Kiryat Arba at the time of Abraham just seems to be quite an anachronism. So we originally read that the town was called Kiryat Arba, and then also known as Chevron. what this may be suggesting is that Chevron might be the more stable name, and Kiryat Arba is the bonus name that tells us a little something else about its history, but that would be history we would only know from later text, from later history. Make sense?
Commentary in the Expion
Mhm.
says it was a confederation of 4 towns.
Yes. So what they're going off of is archaeological evidence, which is that there was the town of 4 meant that there were 4 towns that were linked together, and that area was known as Kiryat Arba because of the 4-ness of those little groups.
Confederation.
According to that, so it's a good theory. Unfortunately, without a time machine, we don't know, no, but that doesn't mean we don't have many other insights. And like I've said before, oftentimes studying the different texts and commentaries in Midrashim is less about being able to produce a movie that would be able to tell you what was on the street sign, and more about creating what lessons we can learn from the interesting juxtaposition of different terms. Does that make sense? Right. So let's take our third paragraph. A new reason of why it's called the town of 4.
We must not misunderstand that Kiryat Arba was the cause of her death.
Right? And she died in Kiryat Arba. We might think she died because she was there. Right? You might think that. People think it all the time. So-and-so moved to New Jersey, and boom, he died a month later. New Jersey killed him.
Yeah.
No. Whatever you may think about New Jersey, it's not like a place that people just walk across the border and drop dead. Okay, so instead, what other explanation could we have?
The reason the town was mentioned is that it was built on the 4 elements.
Okay, now when they say built on the 4 elements, they mean it's built of the 4 elements. Earth, wind, fire, water,
Yep.
Right? 4-element ancient science of what all matter is made up of. Am I getting blank stares here? Right. Nowadays, yeah, we all know matter is made up of atoms. Atoms are great, little tiny things, neutrons, protons, electrons, all that good stuff. Back in the day, people didn't know about atoms. They didn't know atoms from Adam. And they instead thought that everything was made up of 4 elements. That you had things that were made up of dirt, things that were made up of water, things that were made up of wind, and things that were made up of fire. And usually combinations of those elements would be put together. So Kiryat Arba, I don't know why I'm having trouble getting that yat. Kiryat Arba, stretching my mouth. We'll just call it Chevron, but we want to focus on the Arba. Was uniquely composed of a balance of those 4 elements. And that hint is trying to tell us something about death. Well, specifically the death of the righteous. Keep going.
Death implies a departure from or disintegration of the 4 basic elements that a body is composed of.
Right? So normally when you die, the parts that make you up, the material stuff, it falls apart. That's what happens when you die. I hope I'm not upsetting anyone, but decomposition comes after death. So
When the Torah adds that Kiryat Arba is also known as Chevron, that is an allusion to the word kavur, joined.
all right, so why also mention Chevron after having mentioned this 4-element idea? Because it's trying to link us to something, trying to join. There's some joinage going on here that is unique in this particular passing that is trying to teach us about something more general. Onward.
When the righteous die, this is not to be viewed as a process of disintegration. The righteous are still called alive even when they have ceased to function in regular bodies on this earth. This means that while the righteous are alive in this world, the 4 basic material elements that every human being is composed of become transformed into something spiritual and attach themselves to their souls by means of the good deeds that such persons perform during their sojourn on earth. When man cleaves to God, all his elements become transformed into the element of fire, which forms the basis of the soul.
All right, so according to their metaphysics, fire was the form of the soul. And what is he basically saying? He's saying that as a person lives a righteous life, they are turning their body into fire. They're turning their body into soul. They are adding soulness to what is normally just flesh and blood and bone. And therefore, when they die, that soulness continues to live, to be embedded in this world. Not that your soul is trapped in this world, but it is like you transform your body into something that is more spiritual than its own elements would lead you to believe, right? Dirt normally is not spiritual, but the dirt of the body of the righteous has become spiritualized because of it being involved in the performance of mitzvot and the fulfillment of the commandments, of the living of a good and righteous life. It's a beautiful, beautiful image of how the body itself is transformed by the right life a person chooses to live.
The ending of Kohelet.
Mm-hmm.
When the
Of
pitcher is
Ecclesiastes,
broken, when the pitcher is broken and the silver cord is snapped, and the dust returns to the earth, and the spirit returns to
The God which gave it, right?
Yeah, so that this is this metaphysical.
But this is saying that metaphysically, the dust that is left behind by the righteous is of a different substance than it was when it first was put into that body when it was a baby. Right? That when I eat, normally when you're just living a regular life and you're not being righteous or anything, if I eat a piece of chicken, the bits of chicken go into me, they get broken down, they become my cells, and when I die, they just fall back into the dirt. This is saying that when I eat a piece of chicken, if I'm a righteous person, when I do righteous things, that those bits that have now been added to my body take on a soul connection. They are made more than just body parts. And that is something that is a permanent transformation based on your behavior. Question?
This could lead off into a whole discussion on resurrection, which is a whole separate.
Absolutely, yes.
That's a whole separate.
There is a mystical level to this that we're not going to push deeply into today.
Is that related to the aspect of kosher, a kosher animal? If it's not kosher, it's considered a dead meat. It's dead. It's something. But when it's kosher, I've heard, it's not a dead animal because it changes just from being kosher. It takes another nature.
I've never heard that particular teaching. It doesn't sound like anything that I've ever come across.
That's why I ask you because I heard it's not the same as a non-kosher and kosher animal.
So it's when we choose to eat something that is kosher. What this is saying is that we transform it once it goes into our body and it becomes part of us, right? But it was our choice to keep the commandment of kashrut that made that possible. It wasn't the animal itself, right? Kosher meat doesn't have any special magic. Kosher meat is just meat, but it's our following of the commandments that makes that experience special. It's not just, it's not like anybody waves any magic fingers over the.
Yes.
Got it. Okay, so that's another explanation for why we're in Foresville. Onward.
It was so called because of the four giants who lived there: Ahiman, Sheshai, Talmai, and their father.
Who was their father? Arba. Arba was the name of the fourth giant, the father of these other three. We'll come back to that. Right? Just hold on to it for a moment as being, this is another opinion of why it's called Kiryat Arba, is because there were three giants plus their dad, and his name was Arba. So when we call it Arbaville, we mean Arba the Giantsville, who was the father of three, thereby also making Arba giants, making four giants. Yes.
Yeah.
We're working hard on this Arba. Onward.
4 pairs of outstanding human beings were buried in the cave of Machpelah there. They are Adam and Chava, Abraham and Sarah, Yitzhak and Rivka, and Yaakov and Leah.
Right? So we have 4 zugot, 4 pairs, 4 couples that are eventually, in the end, buried in Machpelah, and therefore it's called Kiryat Arba because it is the village of the 4 couples. It's actually 8 people, but it's 4 pairings that are there. What do we think?
Timing's off.
But yeah, at the time they were there, maybe Adam and Chava were buried there. They would have already been buried. That's Adam and Eve. Yes.
So why did Abraham have to purchase the cave?
Oh, well, that's a whole nother story. Yes. And what I think, I don't remember if it was last year or a couple years before that I did the lesson on of why is Abraham buying land that God already told him he owns? And that's called how do you get on with your neighbors? Because God may have told Abraham that he owned the land. He didn't tell the neighbors that Abraham owned the land. And since they were in possession of the land, yeah, there was a necessity to smooth this over. This was Abraham's way of making sure that especially the burial place for Sarah would never be called into question as being his and his descendants' property. That he went above and beyond what might have been necessary by God's standard in order to ensure that even humans wouldn't be able to question this. Turns out humans still do, but that just shows how creative humans can be and how they question things. God bless them. So again, our timeline is a little off. You can't really call it the place of four if only one couple is already buried there and Abraham maybe kind of is going to do it now, so that makes it the place of two. But the other two are definitely coming far into the future. So the question mark. But again, we can circle back and say, well, maybe Chevron was its main name, and the Torah is giving us what would have been the most commonly known name later in life because of this, or the commonly known nickname later in life, because by the time it was reaching its peak audience, that was something that would have already been known and all the other events would have already happened. Maybe. But Siftei Chachamim, who I've been bringing a few more times recently to see if you guys are interested in their wisdom, they are going to try to unpack Rashi and this idea of the four giants and the four pairs to say, is that really the airtight explanation? It seems like there were some holes in this. So they're going to poke a few holes and then they're going to patch the holes, of course. And by doing so, they will shift how we understand them. This is part of the process of elevating our understanding of the basic commentary so that we're not left with a rudimentary or sometimes mistaken understanding of what our primary commentators are saying. Question first? No. Yeah.
Well, how could Adam and Eve even be buried in this cave? And then Abraham comes so much thousands of years later.
Well, yeah.
It's the right cave.
Well, yeah.
Why is it the right cave?
Why would he have picked that cave? This is part of Abraham's connection to God, right? This was not an accident. This wasn't Abraham winning the graveyard lottery.
When they were thrown out the garden, they were made to leave the garden.
Right.
How do I even know that they were in the land of Israel?
Where else would they have gone?
I have no
There's no other better place on earth, which is what we're going to circle back to. The idea that Israel is in fact the best place on earth is going to come back to us as we analyze Chevron itself.
Why would Adam be buried with the patriarchs? Because when they refer to the Jewish people, they always say, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Flip it the other way. Why are the patriarchs buried with him? Right? He was buried there first, according to the Midrash, and then the patriarchs linked themselves to him, which is a very powerful statement that although they were founding a new nation, they were founding a new people, they were still connected to the first people, right? And which means by extension connected to all people. So as much as they may be establishing a new dynasty, they were not separating themselves from the trunk of humanity, which Adam and Chava represent.
But between Abraham and Adam, though, all those lines are cut off then.
No, Shem.
Well, I mean,
Melchizedek.
once you get up to right, yes. I mean, in the meantime, yes, none of Adam's children were officially buried here, is the implication. And between Noah and the people who came after him, none of them were buried here either. It was only Abraham who was able to finally reconnect. And again, that may be an insight going back into the idea that after Noah, what happened was the big dispersal, and people were no longer connected to each other. They no longer consider themselves to even be unified. You have the whole big three groups of nations that spread from Noah's sons, and those seem to go to war with each other and not treat each other as brothers. By Abraham reconnecting to Adam and Chava, there may be a statement here that Abraham, and by extension the Jewish people, are trying to say, we are all connected. Right? Yes, we have our own path to walk, that's the Jewish path, but we are still connected with everyone else from the beginning to now.
And there's a refounding of humanity through Abraham.
Another good way of looking at it, yes.
Okay, I've never been to Chevron because it was always too dangerous
Well, yes.
to ever go there. inside the Machpelah? Is there actually a tomb for?
It is currently forbidden to go down into the cave. So there are prayer spaces where at the surface level, so to speak, of the structure that's there. But the cave underneath it is too politically sensitive for archaeology to take place and too religiously sensitive for archaeology to take place. But there are reports of people who have surreptitiously attempted to penetrate into the caves. And indeed, there are definitely caves down there. But there's no record of finding the bodies, if you will. But it's not like if you go to Machpelah, you're going to find a big box that says Abraham is right here, right? As you would at some other graves,
Right.
where there are definite
I've
sarcophagi.
never come across that Adam and Eve were.
Well, me,
Yeah.
That's
We're very.
and again, what were the sages trying to say by that teaching? Were they just talking about how you'd film the cave, or were they trying to talk about what the symbolism was meant to be by Abraham being buried connected to this root of humanity?
Yes.
Right, or this repurposing, this reconnection to what God's original plan was for humanity. All right, so let's take a little time to poke some holes in these ideas before we patch them up again.
Is Chazal, is that Rashi?
Chazal is Hachamim Zichronam Livracha. It's an acronym meaning the sages, may their memories be blessed. So we're talking about the early sages of the Mishnah and the Talmud.
Okay.
Whenever we say Chazal, that's who we're talking about.
However, I do not know what brought Chazal to say that Kiryat Arba was named after the 4 giants or the 4 couples, when the city's ruler himself was named Arba.
Right? It seems like an unnecessary stretch. Why are we coming up with this midrash when we can just say the leader was Arba?
Chazal should have said that Kiryat Arba means the city of the man named Arba, and then explain why he was named Arba rather than why the city was named Arba.
Right? If you want to, if we know the leader's name is Arba, then the real question isn't why is the city called Arba, because it's called after the leader. The real question is why is the leader called Arba? Make sense?
Yeah.
Exactly. Onward.
Perhaps it is because Chazal found a reason for the city to be called Arba, but not for its ruler to be called Arba.
So maybe it's because the answer they got only applied to the city, not to the guy. And so that's why they're focusing on the city rather than the guy's name. And then onwards.
Therefore, they explained that the city was so called because of the 4 giants or the 4 couples. And the city's ruler was also called Arba after his city's name.
All right. So they have a good explanation for why the city is called Arba. And now they can apply the city explanation as why he took the name of the city. So rather than thinking the city took the name from the leader took the name from the city. Make sense? Right? So Washington wasn't named Washington because of George Washington. George Washington was named Washington because of Washington, D.C. It's not true, but that would be what that would be what they're saying here, right? And you know, you could argue that when people take the name Washington, they're not taking the name Washington because they come from George Washington, but because they're celebrating George Washington. Or if, you know, somebody's last name is Lincoln, chances are that actually from the Lincoln family, they might have chosen the name Lincoln for their family in honor of Abraham Lincoln. And you have to make sure the circle is going the right direction for these explanations. Good? So that's how they solve that question of why they actually identified the explanation of Arba in order to reverse how we thought we were reading what was named for what. But there's more that they want to explain.
Another explanation. So called because of the 4 couples that were buried there. Both explanations are needed because each on its own raises the question, why does the city's name not reflect the reason for its origin?
Right? So why tell us both about the giants and about the 4 couples? Shouldn't we only get one explanation? Right? Rashi usually brings only one explanation when one explanation is sufficient and brings 2 explanations when one explanation didn't cut it. So what was the gap that we needed both of them together to fill?
If after the 4 giants, it should be named Kiryat Anakim.
Right? Which means giants. Right? If you named it for the giants, The outstanding feature of giants isn't how many of them there are. It's the fact that they're giants. So if I'm going to say, look, there are 4 giants over there in that town, let's name it the City of 4, people are going to look at me funny. They're going to say, how about let's name it the City of Giants? But, onward.
And if after the 4 couples, it should be named Kiryat Zugos.
Which means couples. Again, if I'm going to say, there are 4 amazing couples that are buried there, you're not going to, again, naturally call it the City of 4, because that's not really carrying the information. Instead, you would call it the City of Couples, which I think is what Paris calls itself. Or its brotherly love is Philadelphia, right? Yeah. Onward.
But not Kiryat Arba. Since it makes no difference that there were exactly 4 giants or couples, the city should not be called after a number, which is not the reason for its name. That is why Rashi uses both explanations to say that Kiryat Arba is called after the fact that it contains certain things which relate to the number 4. But it was not called after one thing alone. Furthermore,
Okay, let's make sure we got that all together. And we're going to do this with a Venn diagram. Everybody loves these.
All right.
So we got things that are named after giants. And we've got things that are named after couples. And then we've got Kiryat Arba, which is this weird intersection where if I name it after the giants, I'm not going to be mentioning the couples. And if I name it after the couples, I'm not going to be mentioning the giants. The one thing they happen to share is the number of giants and the number of couples happen to overlap. Therefore, if I want to be able to talk about both elements at the same time, I've got to call it Arba. Make sense? Good. And as long as we keep reminding ourselves of what the 4 stands for, we've got 2 birds with 1 stone, or 4 stones. Onward.
Furthermore, we could even say that it was called after the thing itself, but was called a number for the sake of brevity. The word Arba alludes to 2 things the city has, both related to the number 4, and since both are equally alluded to, both are included.
What a wonderful way to compromise. I mean, can you just imagine the group in the committees that were trying to come up with the city name? And one of them said, I think the most important thing in our city is the giants. We should name the city for the giants. Another said, no, you're a fool. We should name the city for the couples that are buried here. Giants, couples, giants, couples. And then one voice said, you know, there's 4 of each. Couldn't we just call it the City of 4s? And thus a compromise was born. See? That's how we compromise, people. It's not hard. Okay. This is the last we hear of Chevron for a long time. But it figures again prominently in a later story, also in the book of Joshua, which you know we've been doing a few snippets from Joshua lately. We'll eventually get to other parts of the Tanakh as well. So let's see how it crops back up in the book of Joshua.
The Judites approached Joshua at Gilgal, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite, said to him, you know what instructions the Lord gave at Kadesh Barnea to Moses, the man of God, concerning you and me.
So what's he referring to? The spies.
The spies, right.
Remember, we had the 12 spies go up during the wilderness period. And 2 of those spies, who were they?
Joshua and Caleb.
Yeah.
And Caleb
So,
has promised that he would be able to go to the land.
Callback, right?
Right.
Caleb comes up to Joshua and says, hey, remember when we were spies? Right? He's remembering from long ago, we're going to find out precisely in just a second, that when they were spies, that Moses had made a certain promise after they had come back and proven themselves faithful. Keep going.
I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land, and I gave him a forthright report, while my companions who went up with me took the heart out of the people. I was loyal to the Lord my God. On that day Moses promised an oath, the land on which your foot trod shall be a portion for you and your descendants forever, because you were loyal to the Lord my God.
All right, so now as we're in the section of the book of Joshua dealing with the allotment of the land to the different tribes, you can sort of see where this is going, right? which is Joshua is handing out the tribes different parcels of land. And Caleb's like, oh, you know, I hate to remind you, but remember when we were on that trip together, when we were the only ones, Moses kind of gave me an IOU saying that I not only wouldn't die in the wilderness, but I would also get a portion of the land special because of my fidelity during that time. Make sense? Okay.
Now the Lord has preserved me as he promised. It is 45 years since the Lord made this promise to Moses when Israel was journeying through the wilderness. And here I am today, 85 years old. I am still as strong today as on the day that Moses sent me. My strength is the same now as it was then for battle and for activity. So assign to me this hill country as the Lord promised on that day. Though you too heard on that day that Anakites are there and great fortified cities, if only the Lord is with me, I will dispossess them as the Lord promised.
All right. So he's basically saying, I was faithful. It's been 45 years. We're finally here. And I will do what is necessary to fight and secure this land. I'm as strong as I ever was. Send me in, coach, and give me what was promised. Good?
Yeah.
Everyone following the story so far? Okay, onward.
So Joshua blessed Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and assigned Hebron to him as his portion.
Dun, dun, dun.
Thus Hebron became the portion of Caleb, son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite, as it still is, because he was loyal to the Lord, the God of Israel. The name of Hebron was formerly Kiryat Arba. He was the great man among the Anakites, and the land had rest from war.
All right, so a lot of things that just happened there with Kiryat Arba. So one, we found out that our timeline of which was called which first seems like this was the first name, Kiryat Arba. So trying to call it Chevron first and then the other second, that doesn't seem to work so well when we line it up with the book of Joshua. But two, this is where we just found out that it was named for Arba the giant. Did you catch it? It happened real quick, right? If you blink, you missed it. So the name of Chevron was formerly Kiryat Arba. He was the great man among the Anakites. Anakites are the giants, right? He was the great. Who's the he? Where are we pointing the word he to? What's its antecedent? What's the antecedent for that pronoun?
Arba.
Yay, grammar. Arba, right? So it's read that Arba, it was the town of Arba. Arba was one of the giants. That's how you would read that sentence in more natural English to fit how it seems to actually mean, rather than just using the place names as though they were nonsense words. Make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the Fox translates this as Arbatown.
Does he really do Arbatown? Very
Arbatown.
cool. Very cool.
Arbatown.
Yeah.
Not Kiryat Arba, Arbatown.
Well, and that's because the word Arba, even if we're not sure about the giant name or the four people or the four giants and all of that, it definitely seems like we can just leave that in quotes rather than trying to translate it. And not translating the phrase Kiryat is, I think, misleading as well. That for our Chumash, I would have been much happier if it had also said the town of Arba, the village of Arba, Arbaville, whichever way you wanted to put it. It does make sense to translate the word Kiryat. Kiryat is a legitimate, normal noun in Hebrew. It's not a person's name. You know, that's just a word. It'd be like not translating the word son, because, you know, we didn't want to, we say, oh, just leave it as saying Shemesh. Like, but if you're making a translation, you're supposed to translate every word you can, not leave some untranslated because you just think it sounds prettier or because that's the name. When you look it up on a map in the modern world, the Kiryat isn't a map reference, it's a word. It means town. And that leaves it more obvious that Arba is a special word rather than just one blended name, which we wouldn't then seek to investigate. Make sense? Right? And again, anytime a translation keeps us from wanting to investigate what the text meant, I call foul. I say the translator made a mistake there. Sometimes they try to make it so easy that they make it too easy. Okay, let's take a little bit of a look at what Caleb is saying here about the timeline, because I think this is pretty interesting.
We
Up, hold on. Question first or comment?
Yeah, why does did Caleb belong to a tribe? Why does he?
He was a
keep saying
Judah.
His
Judah.
father is,
The Kenizzite.
so his mother was from the tribe of Judah.
No, he was from Judah. It's a different family within Judah, a faction.
I see.
What do they call
Like
those?
the Mitchells
Yeah,
and
a clan. Thank you, clan. That was the word I was looking for. Yes.
Okay. But there is a Canaanite? No, Canaanite.
Oh, Canaanites. Yeah,
No,
yeah.
not Canaanite.
The Kenizzite. Yeah, but he was definitely an Israelite, so he wasn't one of the Canaanite groups.
Yes.
I know, too many ites, right? I feel like I'm in geology class.
Moving on.
Yes.
We learned that it took 7 years to conquer the land, for it was in the second year that Moses sent the spies. After that, there remained 38 years during which they traveled through the wilderness, and 7 years to conquer the land, which adds up to 45.
Right, so we get the 45 right here. We know that the spies went in year 2, and we know that they spent 40 total years in the desert. So if you do the math, between the date of the promise, which was 2 years in, there were 38 more years of travel, or waiting, plus some magic number to get to 45 now, which means up to this point, even though we're only 14 chapters into the book of Joshua, they've actually been fighting for 7 years. Right? It doesn't feel like that when you're reading through the book of Joshua. It feels like these battles just keep happening, boom, 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 like it's a steamroller going through the country. But what this is saying is that, no, we're at this point when we're getting the full allotments, it's 7 years in. Make sense? Okay. It's just, again, sometimes little attention to details and doing little math can actually help us put a much better perspective on what we're reading that would have been missed if we just sort of kept going through. And also, it's just amazing to imagine this 85-year-old saying, yeah, we did it. What a sense of accomplishment he must have had. All right, and probably also a lot of, I told them 45 years ago that we could do this. If they'd listened to me back then. All right, last comment where we're going to get a interesting praise of the land of Israel by also poo-pooing on the town of Chevron. Keep going.
They said, perhaps we will not enter a land as beautiful as this. Whereupon the Holy One, blessed be he, said to them, the land is not like Egypt. This teaches that it is superior.
All right, so Sifrei is always a little tricky because it's very concise Midrash text. People were worried about where they're going. God says, don't worry, it's not like Egypt, which the Midrash takes to mean it's better than Egypt. But how do we know it's better than Egypt? I mean, it's not like Egypt. It could be worse than Egypt, right? But if I say, today's not like yesterday, I haven't told you about the relative merit of each of them. I've just told you they're different. So how do we prove that Israel is actually better than Egypt? That's our mission.
You say that Scripture speaks of the superiority of Eretz Israel. Perhaps it speaks of the superiority of Egypt. It is therefore written, Hebron was built 7 years before Zoan. For Zoan was the seat of Egyptian royalty, as it is written in Isaiah. For Egypt's officers were in Zoan.
All right, so this is taken as being an idiom that Hebron was better than Zoan. Now, if Zoan, which was the place for Egyptian royalty, was worse than Hebron, then that's already given us one baseline comparison, right? Right, Zoan would have been a great place in Egypt, and if Hebron is better than it, then Hebron seems to be better than Egyptness. Make sense so far? We're following the logic?
Yeah.
However, now we got to expand it.
If Hebron, which is the worst of Israel, is better than the finest of Egypt, all the more so. This is to praise the land of Israel.
All right, so Hebron is actually considered to be like the least agriculturally desirable chunk of land within the land of Israel proper. I remember when we talked before about the borders, the main borders of Israel don't go down into the deep desert of the Negev. The main borders are in the actual inhabitable areas of the land of Israel. And there was an opinion that Hebron was kind of a dump. Right? Yeah, I mean, who wants to grow stuff there? It's not worth anything to anybody. So if Chevron, which was kind of like meh when it came to its value vis-a-vis like agricultural value, was meh, if that is better than Soan, which is a high place in the land of Egypt, then all the more so the rest of Israel, which is better than Chevron, must be better than the rest of Egypt. You're following that logic? Right? If, let me see if I can do my quick math. Right? If Soan is less than Chevron, and Chevron is less than Israel, then boom, Soan, and Soan is better than the rest of Egypt, then Israel is better than Egypt. Right? Egypt is less than Soan, Soan is less than Chevron, Chevron is less than Israel, therefore Israel is greater than Egypt. Magic of logic. It's kept our people alive for a couple thousand years at least. Last line though, where we get a beautiful insight. Yes.
And thus you find with the ways of the Lord that whatever is more beloved precedes its neighbor. Torah, the most beloved of all, precedes all, as it is written in Proverbs. The Lord acquired me, Torah, in the beginning of his way, before his works of yore. And also, I was poured out from everlasting, from the beginning, from the origin of the earth.
So before we get too caught up in land real estate value, we also have to put something else at the end of this line, which is Torah. And Torah is better than all. Right? Torah trumps everything. And that's where we're going to leave it with this this beautiful image that, as important as Chevron is, as important as all of this discussion of where she was buried, why it was named, and what we've learned from that, what we've actually been doing is reminding ourselves that the true goal wasn't about putting a price value on the land, which remember, Abraham didn't even haggle over. The true goal was reminding ourselves that Torah and the study of Torah is better than everything. Good?
Right.
Good.
I worked at a
Go get it.